Good morning. Today on Spotlight, the second impeachment trial of former U.S. President Donald J. Trump. It's a historic trial that could have long-term implications for our nation and both major political parties. Or is it a waste of time and resources? We'll ask two legal experts and constitutional scholars, Professor Richard Primus of the University of Michigan Law School and Professor Jonathan Weinberg of Wayne State University Law School. It's Sunday, February the 7th. I'm Chuck Stokes, and this is Spotlight. What should the public expect to see in this second trial? And do you think it's going to be full of hard-hitting factual information, or is this just going to be political grandstanding?
Well, I think the public should expect to see a faster trial than the first one. I think the public should expect to see a presentation about the events of the attack on the Capitol designed to make the Senate remember that it really happened and that it was really a big, scary, important, dangerous thing. I don't think that, unlike the first trial, the House managers don't need to explain a complicated web of relationships that explain what went wrong. This was a physical attack on a branch of government in broad daylight. So what they really need to do is just bring that home to the public and the Senate in a way calculated to make it hard for people to ignore.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. Although one thing I'd caution is that the audience for this in a real way is not the Senate, but the American people. That the Democratic House managers are going to try and remind us what happened last month. They're going to fill in some information about that and how serious it was that we didn't have last month. But the real question in this trial is going to be that if we have a US president who loses an election, who for months is lying about that, says he didn't lost, he won by a landslide that was somehow stolen from him by forces nefarious, who incites a mob to attack the Capitol to prevent the votes being counted. I mean, is this business as usual? Is this, just the way we do things now? Or is this something unique in American history that needs to be condemned, for which people need to be held accountable so it doesn't happen again?
Can you really have a trial that is fair in such a political atmosphere? Either one.
Well, you can have a trial that's fair. The question really is whether the jurors will vote on the evidence or whether the jurors will vote in the way that they think their voters will require them to. And the chances are that a lot of members of the Senate will vote to acquit, not because they have the view that it's okay for presidents to send mobs to attack the Senate, but because they have voters who want them to support President Trump even after he's lost and even after this has happened. And impeachment is always going to have that feature, right? It is a trial, but it's a trial where the jurors are senators who respond to voters.
One thing about this is that this is very different from a criminal trial in one respect, which is criminal trials are about somebody going to jail. Criminal trials about people's freedom being taken away. And for that reason, the Constitution demands all sorts of impartiality, all sorts of rules designed to achieve fairness. This isn't that. This is a trial about who can work for us, the American people in high office. Who do we trust to work for us? Who has forfeited their ability to work for us? And the framers of the Constitution thought that was a political choice, and they put it in the hands of the senators who are political actors. That's got good consequences and bad consequences. One of the things it means is that the senators, may, for reasons of political convenience, decide, well, what this guy did was really inexcusable. But we're going to vote in his favor anyway because we don't want to get punished at the polls.
Sure. All right. Let me take a quick little break. We're going to come right back. And I want to get into your take on what we keep hearing, and that is First Amendment rights and how much is it protected. We'll be right back. Stay with us. And welcome back to Spotlight. Professors, let me read you a few things that President Trump, former President Trump, said in that infamous speech that everybody talks about, which I'm sure we're going to hear in the trial, and it gets into the question about First Amendment rights and how much our free speech is protected. We heard him say statements like, "We won this election and we won it by a landslide. We will stop the steal. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. If you don't concede when there's theft involved, our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore. You have an illegitimate president. That is what you will have. And we can't let that happen." And probably the one that's getting the most attention, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Is that free speech that is protected? Professor Weinberg.
So there's a difference between, say, sending a private citizen to jail for saying something and saying that the President of the United States and civil office holder is abusing his office when he says the same things. Because if I were just walking around, in the middle of Campus Martius Park, and I said, gee, the election was stolen, well, I can say that. That's my First Amendment right. No one can put me in jail for saying it. But if you've got the President of the US losing an election and illegitimately trying to stay in office by saying the same things, inciting a mob to attack the Capitol by saying the same things, that's something that we can say disqualifies him from being president. That's something we can say disqualifies him from being president ever again, because that's an abuse of his office.
The First Amendment means that you can't send a person to jail for expressing an opinion. But imagine a judge at a trial before the trial starts looks at the defendant and says, I think you're guilty. We haven't had the trial yet, but I think you're guilty, right? If a person on the street who is reading about the trial said, I think that guy's guilty, that's okay. That's free speech. He can have his opinion. But the judge at the trial can't look at the defendant at the beginning and say, I think you're guilty. That person can't be a judge anymore, or a judge who did that should be impeached. And similarly, a private citizen could say, I hope Russia conquers the United States. But if the president of the United States stands up and says that, he can't be president anymore, right? Or if the president of the United States stands up and says, I don't promise to defend the Constitution anymore. I don't make that promise anymore. It's incompatible with his office. Now, he can't be sent to jail for those things, but he also isn't fit for office anymore and needs to be impeached. What will happen in the trial is that President Trump's defenders will say things about the First Amendment as if they were a defense, because lots of people in the public, for good reasons, like the idea of free speech. And if they can make it sound like it's a free speech issue, it will give the president's supporters cover to defend him and not to vote to convict him. But that's all it is cover. It's very broadly understood among First Amendment scholars, right and left politically, that there isn't a First Amendment defense available to the president here.
When the former president stands up and says this election wasn't fair, it was stolen, is this similar in terms of, well, he's citing one set of facts as he sees them versus a whole bunch of other people who have said, no, this was a fair election. I go back to the old thing, can you stand up in a movie theater and yell fire when there really isn't a fire, and you get a stampede and someone ends up getting hurt or killed in the process? Can you come back later and say, well, yeah, there wasn't a fire, but I saw smoke. Well, then it gets into the old question of, can they prove that you really saw smoke, or was that just a red herring? Either one of you.
The important thing to keep in mind here is that we're determining the president's fitness for office. That's what this impeachment trial is about. Is he indeed so unfit for office? Has he so disqualified himself by his actions that he should be legally barred from ever being president again? And with that in mind, when we look at what he said, there are only two possibilities. One is that he's deliberately lying. He's been deliberately lying for months. He knows there is no reason whatsoever to think that he lost this election. Or I suppose the other possibility is that he's delusional. He's off in some fantasy world where, Jews start wildfires by operating space lasers from Mars, and he won the election by a landslide. And either way, that's a person who should be disqualified from ever being president again. It doesn't really matter which one of those it is.
All right, we're going to take another quick break. We'll come right back, and we'll continue on this and whether or not it is constitutional to be able to hold an impeachment trial for someone who's not still in office. We'll be right back. Other statements he made that day, he said to the crowd, we will go peacefully and patriotically, make our voices heard down to the Capitol. And we are going to the Capitol. Of course, he never did go down with the rest of the crowd. Won't that be part of his defense, that he'll say, no, I didn't incite this riot. I told them that this should be peaceful?
Well, he'll definitely say that. And if this were a criminal prosecution for incitement of violence, the prosecutor might have a tricky time with that. But it's not a criminal prosecution for incitement of violence. It's an impeachment trial to determine whether he's disqualified from further office. And his disqualification for further office is clear simply from the fact of lying about the election result to the crowd, encouraging them, inspiring them to sack the Capitol building and terrorize the Congress, even if it's not technically incitement, and then not doing anything about it once they proceeded. If there's an angry mob terrorizing Congress and sacking the Capitol building, and the President of the United States is just watching on television rather than intervening actively to fix the problem, he's not acting consistently with his oath of office. A person like that isn't qualified to hold office.
Professor Weinberg, is the maybe bigger challenge for the Democrats in this impeachment whether or not you can hold someone who is still no longer in office up for impeachment, even though the impeachment was voted on from the House before he left office, only a week before he left office? He's no longer in office now. That's never been done before, and except for the case of, I think, in 1876 with the Secretary of War, but that got a little more complicated, and when all was said and done, he ended up getting acquitted from the Senate. Is this constitutional, or will this possibly go to the Supreme Court?
Politically, this is a challenge because 45 Republican senators are likely to get up there on the floor of the Senate and say, I'm voting to acquit the president, and this is why. But legally, it's not a challenge. Legally, I think there was strong consensus among legal scholars that the House and Senate did have the power to impeach and try presidents after they left office, until it became politically convenient to say otherwise. But if we look at the time of the framing, they looked to English parliamentary impeachment practice, and it was standard that the English Parliament impeached people who had no longer been in office. Indeed, the framers talked about one of those cases in the U.S. colonies and the U.S. states in their early years. There was a history of impeaching officers after they left office. And as you just said, we already argued this out once in the case of Secretary Belknap. who was indeed not only tried after he left office, but impeached after he left office. And the Senate said that was completely fine. And moreover, it makes sense because impeachment isn't just about removing somebody from office. Impeachment is also about disqualifying someone from office, about saying what this person did was so egregious that he can never hold federal office again, or at least he can never hold executive or judicial office again.
Professor Primus?
There's nothing in the Constitution that suggests that you can't do the disqualification, even if it's too late to do the removal. And that's really what this trial is about.
The result of an impeachment conviction is removal and then possibly disqualification. This trial is not about removal. He's out. It's about disqualification. It's always the case when the Senate votes a disqualification that it's voting on somebody who's not in office anymore, because removal always comes first, right? That is, you have to remove someone, and then you can decide also on the disqualification. And if the Senate couldn't vote to disqualify someone who wasn't in office anymore, then the Senate could never actually disqualify someone, because anyone who was in danger of being disqualified would just resign the moment before the impeachment conviction vote took place. And the framers didn't design the Constitution's checks and balances to be avoided that easily, right? We have an impeachment process to remove and to disqualify when people behave egregiously in office. And to say that you can't do it if they leave right one step ahead of the vote would be to undermine the process completely. It's not really hard as a constitutional question. But as Professor Weinberg says, it's something that the president's defenders can say as an excuse for why they won't vote to convict him. The important thing, therefore, is for Congress to try to educate the public to understand this is about disqualification and not just about removal. And disqualification is a thing that still matters, and the Constitution is designed to let that decision be made about somebody who's already been removed.
If the Democrats and the two independents stick together, they're going to need 17 Republicans to be able to come over to their side. Given the very partisan charged nature of our country and this trial, do either of you believe that when it's all said and done, that President Trump will be convicted?
No.
Professor Primus?
Lincoln in the second inaugural said, he was talking about how the war would end, with high hopes for the future. No predictions with regard to it are ventured. I feel something similar here. I think we shouldn't give up hope that there are 17 Republican senators who, push come to shove, won't say it's okay for the president to inspire a mob to sack the Capitol and terrorize us, right? But I don't think that we should count on its happening, because we've seen over the last several years lots of ways in which the system doesn't operate quite the way we might hope it would.
Professor Weinberg, I'm going to go back to you for the final word. You said no. Was part of that no because there's just too much politics here and you can't get politics regardless of what facts and arguments come out on the floor of the Senate? And what does that mean in terms of whether or not we're wasting our time and resources?
I think no, because there's too much politics here. Because 45 Republican senators have already put themselves on record as saying they think this impeachment trial shouldn't happen at all. And with high hopes for the future, those 45 senators are not likely votes to convict. But at the same time, I think this is absolutely not a waste of time, because we need to keep in mind what happened here. The President of the United States attempted to subvert a presidential election. He attempted to subvert a presidential election. He lost. He attempted to subvert that election through violence. And the question is, do we just let that go by? Do we say, well, no big deal. He failed this time. Maybe someone else will succeed the next time they try to subvert an election, but, we'll worry about that when the time comes. Or do we draw a line and say, this can't happen? This is something for which he needs to be held accountable for. And to the extent it's the latter, and I think it is, that means that the House managers have to go forward with this impeachment trial. Even if political convenience means that in the end, they're not going to secure 67 votes for conviction.
Professor Jonathan Weinberg of Wayne State University and Professor Richard Primus of the University of Michigan, thank you for your legal analysis and your insight. It all begins in just 2 days, and we'll see what the final outcome is on this very historic trial. Thank you so much, and good luck at teaching all this to your students as well. It's a pleasure having both of you.
Pleasure
Happy to
being
be here.
When we come back, a little good news and a little bad news. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Finally, some bad news and a little good news. Our condolences to the family and friends of Sister Mary Watson, the founder of Detroit St. Patrick's Senior Center and a former Michiganian of the Year. She was a Detroit gem, and she passed away last week in Racine, Wisconsin. And now the good news. Congratulations are in order for prominent Detroit banker and businessman John Carter of J.P. Morgan Chase. Carter officially retired last week after serving decades as one of the city's top executives. You may recall that on Crain's 2015 list of the 100 most connected business people, Carter took the very top spot. I remember sitting down with him on a spotlight.
I'm honored that the magazine chose me, but I want to be really candid that, when somebody like Dan Gilbert or Roger Penske is on that list and I'm ahead of them, that list is a little flawed.
Has this recognition made life a little more difficult for John C. Carter?
I've been teased a lot for a couple of weeks, and my friend Casey Crane, who runs Cranes, I told him I couldn't wait for the next issue to come out.
We wish him well in retirement. I'm Chuck Stokes. We'll be back next week with more newsmakers in the spotlight. We hope you have a great week.